Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, and this season proudly brought to you by Monocle Solutions. And it's time to talk about what's going on from a macroeconomic and investment perspective. The world in a period of profound change. We've got the rise of autocrats. We've got democracy under threat, decades high inflation, energy shocks, the climate conversation, rising inequality. And my next guest has seen his fair share of cycles and certainly when it comes to inflation and commodities. He's a legendary investor and financial commentator, the chairman of Beeland Interests. He's the co-founder of the Quantum Fund and Soros Fund Management. He was also the creator of the Rogers International Commodities Index. I'm joined now by Singapore-based Jim Rogers. Jim, great to have you on the show.
I am delighted to be here, Michael. I'm a fan of South Africa, so I'm very happy to be here.
Now, you've had a fascinating career, Jim. Could you just provide a brief summary of how you first got into investing and what sort of career you've had since?
Well, I stumbled onto Wall Street because I interviewed a guy and I liked him and he liked me and he was on Wall Street. I didn't know. I knew Wall Street was in New York. I knew something bad happened in 1929. I didn't know there was a difference in stocks and bonds. I thought all that stuff was the same thing. So it was quite by accident, but I fell in love very quickly because it was a place that my love was to know what was going on in the world. And here was a place that would pay me to keep track of what was happening in the world and to try to figure out the future. So I couldn't believe it. They would pay me to do that. So I went to Wall Street, had an early hedge fund. We started one of the first hedge funds in the 1970s. We had a very successful career. And in 1980, I retired. I was 37 because I'd always wanted to have more than one life. And I set out to see the world. I drove around the world twice, including South Africa twice on those trips. So my goal was to have adventure, so I did.
And you certainly have. You've wound up in Singapore now, where you find yourself, and very close to what is the rising Asian sun there, and that really is demographically and economically where the world is shifting. Just before we move on, how did you find South Africa driving through it?
Well, the first time I drove through was 1991, and it was, well, you probably remember, it was a bit of an isolated country in those days for many reasons. It was a beautiful country. It was better organized than most African countries at that time. It wasn't that much there, but it was certainly a fascinating place. Cape Town was extraordinary then. It's still extraordinary. But everywhere was quite something. And the second time was 2000, the year 2000. Things had changed to a certain extent. It was more open, more lively, more sophisticated, and still a good time.
Well, it sounds like you take it in 20-year spans. So we've got to invite you back and then you can give us another insight into how the country's evolved. We're grappling with our own energy crisis, but then who isn't in the world at the moment? If you look at what's going on in Europe, and your investing career spans nearly 60 years and the times we now live in are truly unique. I would probably say they're probably most similar to the 1970s when you launched your hedge fund, because you've got an energy shock coupled with high inflation. But how has the Russia-Ukraine crisis really highlighted, firstly, Russia's influence on global economics from where you sit, and particularly in terms of its control of key energy commodities like oil and gas?
Well, we've had periodic wars, small wars, in the last 50 or 60 years, as you astutely point out. This one, I hope, stays a small war. This one affects a bit more because it affects energy. Both Ukraine and Russia have energy, and they both have grain. And needless to say, most of us like eating. So this one affects more raw materials than some other wars have. And that therein lies a problem. We were already having inflation because of staggering amounts of money printing all over the world, especially in Washington, D.C. So inflation was here. Then along came this bit in Ukraine, and that's just making it worse. I don't know if there are any periods I'm sure there are periods like this in history. I know there are periods when we've had high inflation. I've lived through some of them. And here we are having it again. this inflation had already started before Ukraine happened, because the U.S., not just the U.S., but especially the U.S., was printing so much money. So we started having inflation, and it's going to get worse, Michael. I don't particularly like it, but it's going to get worse.
What would you say is the major driver? I think the inflationary theme is the big talking point, obviously, in markets at the moment, exacerbated by what's going on with the war in Ukraine with Russia. But to your point, really triggered by what we've seen ever since the global financial crisis. Record amounts of quantitative easing, money printing, expanding the Fed's balance sheet, and really central banks taking that key role. What do you see as ultimate end game here? I mean, the Fed funds rate at 4.3%, will that rein inflation in?
Well, Michael, in 1980, the last time we had a big inflation decade, the interest rate on U.S. Treasury bills was over 20%. That's not a typo. Interest rates went to over 20% in order to take care of the inflation problem. So we're nowhere near what we might have to experience this time around. Inflation's much worse this time. The amount of money printing is much, much worse. It's all over the world this time. You know, in 1980s, America was still a creditor nation. Now we're the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. There was still the Soviet Union there, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many differences this time, which would make me, anyway, worried that things are going to have to get much worse, in other words, in terms of interest rates and or economic slowdown, to solve the problem this time. Or they may not solve it. They may just give in and print more money. But that will lead to even higher inflation and a bigger collapse eventually.
Yeah, kicking the can down the road springs to mind. And you're on record as having previously this year, having said that the dominance of the US dollar is at risk here because it's being used as a political tool. And the one thing we have seen is like the king dollar, it's almost smashed every single other asset class. Can you just expand on that?
Well, I own a lot of U.S. dollars, but you know, this time around, the U.S. The U.S. dollar is the world international medium of exchange, as you know. But the world's medium of exchange is supposed to be neutral. Anybody's supposed to be able to use it for anything. But now Washington is changing those rules. If Washington gets angry at you, they cut you off. They say, oh, you cannot use dollars anymore. But most of the world is saying, wait a minute. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So now everybody is looking for something to compete with the dollar, because even our friends are worried about getting cut off now. U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, so there's certainly economic reasons to look for one. Now there are also political reasons to look for something else, because you might get cut off. So this is not, I don't like saying it, I'm an American citizen, but I see what's happening. And as I say, even our friends are saying, wait a minute, we could get cut off, so we've got to find something else. Now, Michael, I don't know what they're going to find. I don't know what the world's going to find. If you know, please do not announce it on the air. Send me an email, okay, so I can buy some too.
And I know, that feeds into the global power game that we're talking about here, one of the big macro themes. And we've seen many Western countries implementing sanctions against Russia. It continues to sell its energy as a response to massive markets. You think of India here, China, and to a certain extent, South Africa has its own relationship through BRICS with Russia. How is this affecting the global power balance between the West and the East? And also given what you've just said here about the weaponization to an extent of the dollar?
Well, eventually, once everybody moves away from the U.S. dollar, the U.S. is going to lose a lot of its soft power, because if you have the world's international medium of exchange, you are very important whether you know it or not. And you have a lot of influence. That is in the process of changing for many reasons, which we just discussed. And I'm afraid it's going to eventually, something else is going to be the currency. And then America will just lose more and more of its power. I mean, 100 years ago, it was pound sterling. Well, not many people think of England as a major world power anymore. We certainly did 100 years ago, but that was 100 years ago. So again, I don't like saying it, but I can see what's happening. An obvious choice would be the Chinese currency, but Michael, the Chinese currency is a blocked currency. You can't just go online and buy and sell it like you can the dollar or the euro or something. So that's not practical at the moment. So I don't know what the world is going to move to.
Well, maybe something like the gold standard back again, and that'll certainly suit South Africa with our gold reserves. When you look, though, at the what's happening here, it does look like a decline in democracy in effect as well. So how can Western countries and others that don't abide by the kind of autocratic ideologies of countries like Russia take back the economic control that they've lost because of this evolving Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, I'm afraid if you go back throughout history, there have always been people gaining more and more power, but we've always had dictators. We're not the first ones to think of dictators, to know about dictators and kings and emperors, etc. I'm afraid it's going to continue. I certainly see what Mr. Putin is doing. Certainly see what's happening in China. China opened up a lot for 40 years, not so opening up now as they were. I mean, even the U.S. is putting more and more restrictions on all of us. So we may be entering a period in world history when we have more and more closed economies. And that often leads to conflict, obviously, because dictators think that they're all powerful and that they cannot make mistakes. So read your history. You'll see that this has happened before and it may be happening again.
Yeah, but that's, I think, the major concern for many, and why it's so important to be aware of that as an investor is that we seem to be repeating all the same mistakes. And so the one thing about history is it does tend to rhyme. Now, the geopolitical situation is not just around the pinching of gas pipelines causing energy supply shocks in Europe. I think another big concern is how the climate change narrative has now been put aside because of all of the geopolitical uncertainty, and how this might potentially delay important decisions when it comes to trying to rein in the amount of carbon that we are pumping into the atmosphere. The evidence, the scientific consensus seems to be that we're inexorably marching towards a much warmer world. That means greater frequency of high-risk flood, drought, increasing costs of insurance, costs of doing business, mass migration. What are the implications of this from an economic and investor perspective?
Well, you just told me, it's going to be the increased cost of everything, and it's going to be a more difficult world in which to live and to do business, and it's more difficult to move assets or to trade. It'll be more and more difficult to trade because more and more people will cut each other off. They'll blame other countries for problems. Whenever there's a problem, whenever things go bad in a country, the politicians blame the foreigners. That's the first thing you do. You blame the foreigners because it's very easy to blame the foreigners. And throughout history, they have, because the foreigners have different skin, different languages, different food, different everything, different religions. So you start blaming the foreigners, and the next thing you know, you have trade wars and sometimes shooting wars. So periods when the world is closed off have not been a lot of fun.
And that's, again, feeding into this rising decoupling narrative. The world that was rapidly globalizing seems to be de-globalizing and becoming more insular. Not a good sign. For you, what do you see as the path forward to fixing some of the damage and particularly to help restore a global concerted effort to try and avert the worst impacts of climate change and a rising autocracy? How do we do it if there is any hope?
Well, you know how we do it. We stop using carbon as much as we have been used. The world knows what to do. Will the world do it? I don't know, because it does turn out to be expensive. Europe right now is regretting that they closed a lot of their coal-powered plants. They are sorry that they closed some of their nuclear-powered plants because this costs money and inconvenience and complications and difficulties. So we know the answers to a lot of things, Michael, but do we do it? And sometimes we find it's not so much fun. I mean, we all know that if you do your homework, you'll do well on the test at school, but we don't want to do our homework. We don't want to have to study so hard, even though we know the consequences.
In light of all of this, just a last question, Jim. So what does this mean for the future global economy? If you were to look into your crystal ball and say, well, this is how I envisage the global economy of 20, 30, 40 years from now to look like, what is your kind of scenario that you're mapping out into the future, given all of this that we've just discussed?
Well, sometime in that period of time, we're going to have a very, very serious economic problem. In 2009, we had a problem because of too much debt. Since 2009, debt everywhere has skyrocketed, Michael. I mean, everybody, even China has a lot of debt now. So the next time we have an economic problem, it has to be the worst in my lifetime, because I can see what's happening. I mean, these are simple facts. All this staggering amount of debt which is built up. And when we start having serious economic problems, that's when you start having more trade wars. That's when politicians blame more foreigners. And those wars often lead to, nobody's ever won a trade war. Trade wars have always been bad for the world economy. It will be again. So I would suspect we're going to have some very difficult economic times. You said 30 or 40 years. Sometime in the next decade, sooner, we're going to have very, very serious economic problems worldwide. And throughout history, that has often led to geopolitical problems as well. So you should be worried.
Well, I am worried. This is why we're talking to you and why we want to, shed more light on this, because I don't think many people, or as many people as should be worried, are worried about this and are talking about it at the moment to try and avoid the catastrophic. What I do know is that being here on the southern tip of Africa provides some form of isolation and insulation, but we won't be completely insulated from a global economic scenario that you've just painted. Jim, always a pleasure. Let me know when you're going to be next in South Africa. I'd love to show you around the place. Take care.
Boy, I'd love to come to South Africa, and I certainly will let you know. It's a lot of fun. I've always had good times in Africa and South Africa. So I hope so. Thank you, Michael. It's been fun.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Be careful.
I will. Jim Rogers, legendary investor and financial commentator. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us here on Business Talk. Cheers.